Okay, good mid-morning, everybody. Welcome to the Asheville City Council agenda briefing. My name is Esther Manheimer. I'm mayor of the city of Asheville, and I'd like to welcome you to this meeting. This is January 23rd, 2025. All council members and staff are participating virtually. The meeting will be live streamed on the city's YouTube channel or through the city's virtual engagement hub, which is accessible through the front page of the city's website. You may listen to the meeting via phone at 855-925-2801, meeting code 7565. And as with all of our agenda briefing meetings, we do not take public comment. Council and staff, please unmute yourselves and say a quick hello when I call your name. Just a side note, Councilmember Shanika Smith is not able to join us today. She has a work conflict. So first of all, I'll introduce our Vice Mayor, Antoinette Mosley.
Good morning.
Councilmember Kim Roney.
Good morning.
Councilmember Maggie Ullman. Oh, I'm sorry. She will be joining us just slightly later into the meeting. Councilmember Bo Hess.
Good morning.
Councilmember Sage Turner.
Good morning.
City Manager Deborah Campbell.
Good morning.
Assistant City Manager Rachel Wood.
Good morning.
Assistant City Manager Ben Woody.
Good morning.
City Attorney Brad Branham.
Good morning.
City Clerk Maggie Burleson.
Good morning.
Okay, and I'll now turn it over to the City Manager Deborah Campbell.
Thanks, Mayor. And again, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second council agenda briefing meeting of the year to prepare for your business meeting on January the 28th. That meeting, as usual, will start at 5 p.m. and will be held in the chamber of City Hall. Today's agenda will include an overview and discussion of the items scheduled for action or discussion at your business meeting on January 28th. Assistant City Manager Ben Woody will cover these items. We don't have any council committee agenda items to review since we haven't restarted those meetings. We'll briefly review the 8-week agenda and another document that lists a schedule of meetings related to Helene recovery efforts. And then lastly, which we'll spend the majority of our time on, our 2 items under the other issues and update section of today's agenda. First, Jay Dundas and advisors with Haggerty Consulting Group will provide an update on the state of city assets, as well as discuss the FEMA Public Assistance Program that we will be relying on as a major source of funding to help make repairs and replace damaged properties and our other city assets that were impacted by Helene. The second item is one that you all requested be added to an upcoming agenda related to new legislation that has recently passed that impacts a local municipality's authority to initiate downzonings. I'll now turn it over to Ben for a review of the business agenda. Ben.
Thank you, Ms. Campbell, and good morning, Mayor, members of council. I'm just going to jump right in. So we'll start with your business agenda and the consent agenda. We actually have comparatively a relatively small consent agenda for this meeting. So I'm going to cover 2 items, and please let me know if you have questions or if there's another item you want me to cover. So I'm going to start today with item E. Item E is a ratification of 2 existing contracts to continue providing software services for transit scheduling and planning and for automated counting of passengers that board and leave a bus. Both these contracts have been in place for 4 and 5 years respectively, so we've had them in place for a while. And the reason this is before council now is that cumulatively with these 2 options to extend, each contract will exceed a total of $90,000, which requires council approval. So that's why this is before you. And the other item I want to cover today is item F. Item F is an amendment to our city contract with Haggerty Consulting. As council and the community are aware, Haggerty Consulting has been providing support as we move through the recovery process. This amendment brings a total contract amount to a not to exceed of $5.9 million. Just want to note that we do expect that the majority of this expense will be reimbursed by FEMA or other federal agencies. And as we continue to move forward with the recovery process, the city's ongoing work with Haggerty will focus on maximizing our cost recoverable opportunities and also maximizing our funding resources, both to support the city's infrastructure, housing, and economic recovery efforts. Any questions on those items or any other consent items? Okay, I'm going to keep moving. We got a lot at the end of the agenda today. Or Councilman Roney, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, so I guess it's just a technical question. We could probably figure this out offline, but I think we have some other like a boards and commissions appointment that we normally have to vote on. Usually like kind of a staggered process of recusals and things that have to happen. So I'm looking forward to seeing more of those. I'm very grateful the vice mayor is willing to serve on the TDA, and I do see that on our agenda.
Maggie, Maggie Burleson, do you want to add anything or we?
The item on the agenda now is the only one that was pending from when Sandra Kilgore left. And so I'm sure that the liaison and other member appointments will be discussed soon. The mayor will need to give me direction on the council committees as well.
Okay, yeah, I was just thinking specifically of like the airport authority was the other one that's lingering, and I know we probably want to have someone there.
Whoever is liaison for the boards last year, we're asking that they continue to be liaisons until any changes are made. And I don't think—
Were you thinking who's our liaison to the airport authority? Were you thinking that was Sandra?
It was.
Sage. I'm the airport board, y'all.
Okay,
Yeah,
if that changed midterm, I missed that. I'm sorry.
thanks.
Thank you, Maggie. Appreciate helping out with that question. So moving on under presentations and reports, we're going to have Steph Dahl and Nikki Reed provide an update on the implementation of our affordable housing plan and the related UDO updates. As council is well aware, this was work that we were really leaning into prior to Hurricane Helene. So what this is doing is, one is picking that work back up and updating council, but also giving you an indication the work actually never stopped, because a lot of the recommendations in the affordable housing plan are things that we actually have done and initiated as part of our recovery efforts. So what Nikki and Steph will do is include an overview of that work and what we've done as it relates to recovery, but also provide council with an updated plan of work and timeline for how we move that important initiative forward.
And Ben, if I could just add that, excuse me, this is under the manager's report. So this will be another relatively lengthy manager's report, but we hope that we can keep it to no more than about 20 or 30 minutes, but we will have also opportunities for you all to ask any questions in terms of that status report. So just wanted to add that, Ben. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Campbell. And then moving on to, under public hearings, we have an item that's actually not a public hearing, but it was continued from the last meeting. And this is the proposed zoning text amendments to our UDO to better align it with FEMA NFIP requirements in the state building code. Following your January 14th meeting, we were asked to go out and conduct some meetings with different groups in the community. Staff has either participated in or arranged several of those community or business related meetings. And what we did is discuss the ordinance and address any questions related to those changes. So far what we've done is we met with SIBO on January 17th. We were at the RAD roundtable also on January 17th. A group of staff were at the Biltmore Village Merchants Association meeting yesterday. And then today our team has a meeting, an open house of sorts at the Public Works building later this afternoon. So we've tried to make ourselves available to explain and also answer questions about these amendments. Real quickly, my general takeaways from what I've seen is, number one, is that the community members do seem to have a better understanding of the requirements for what it takes to rebuild in the floodplain. It is very technical and complicated, but I do think we have improved some of the general understanding of that. I also hope that our community, and I believe they do, have a better awareness of some of the support resources that are made available. And that's not just resources from the state and FEMA, but some of the things the city staff and departments are doing to be a resource. The last thing I will note, though, and this is just, and I've heard this at times, I think there's still some concern with a 2-foot freeboard for substantially damaged properties. That has come up, and probably that piece has generated the most discussion in these meetings. So I just want to flag that for council's consideration. But again, I think we've been able to hear and educate the community as best we can through those meetings.
But also being as a support, support for the changes in the process is the new FAST effort that we and Mark is spearheading.
Yeah, we've had a really positive, thank you for bringing that up, Ms. Campbell. The Flood Assistance Support Team is a key group of staff that are they're singularly focused on helping these property owners make good decisions based on their situation. That team is up and running. We've really promoted that heavily, getting a pretty positive response from that. I think as of this morning, we've had or have scheduled to have, I think 6 or 7 of those meetings already. So that's really just in the first week. So people are beginning to take advantage of that. And again, hopefully that'll be a resource for our property owners. Councilwoman Turner.
Thank you. I really appreciate you doing more outreach in general and so many direct meetings. I think that's wonderful. I'm curious because I couldn't remember if this was correct, but I believe when we're talking about the 1 foot or the 2 foot, we're still talking about the 100-year flood level, right? Like at some point FEMA may update the maps and it could change, or is that incorrect? Like somewhere I saw if we did a 4 foot or a 3 foot, it would prepare us for some other level larger or higher.
Yeah, the flood maps, the current base flood elevations we have, they are what they are. So you may have a watermark from Helene, but the regulatory floodplain and base flood elevation is still what it was before Helene. So yeah, your freeboard is based on the existing maps. They probably will change at some point in the future. But to more directly answer your question, elevation is risk-based. So the more you elevate, the lower your risk is, and therefore the lower your insurance premiums will be. So it's really an actuarial program in a sense. So you have to elevate 2 feet, but yes, you could elevate 4 feet, and that probably is more reflective of future maps potentially, and that probably in the immediate term reduces your risk from damage and reduces, your premium amounts for flood insurance. So those are things we want property owners to understand as they make these decisions.
Well, and I guess if I'm a property owner and I've got a 20-foot water line, rebuilding it 2 foot doesn't feel like it really matters, but yeah, okay, that's helpful. And I think, Esther, at some point you had said it could take FEMA like years, like maybe they were still finishing up some 2014 flood data.
Yeah, and Amy's on the call here. In terms of new flood maps, I know that is in process for Asheville. Amy, could you just give us a little bit of a framework on maybe what that looks like?
Last time I talked to the state floodplain mapping program, they said that our draft flood maps would be out early to late winter of 2025.
Wow, that's great. And hi, Amy, thank you.
Well,
Yep, and they do
and
want,
Amy,
well, I'll just to add to that, they do want to do some additional LiDAR capturing of information just to see, because they realized that Helene changed our streams drastically. So they do want to do some additional data gathering just to see how that change impacts the maps. And that will take place.
Amy,
Sorry.
in terms of the process for the new maps, when you say they'll be out, say by the end of the year or whatever, does that mean that they're out to start the very long review and comment process? So they won't be the ones that are in effect yet. How long does that usually take before you actually have the new maps that will be used by the building department?
Yes, they will issue the draft maps. There will be a public review and public comment period. I will say I'm not certain, but that usually runs a 30 to 60 day period where the community can review them and provide comments back whether or not they feel like these things are accurate or not. But you will have to supply some technical data to support any changes that need to be made. But yes, there will be a public period, and my understanding is that starts when the draft maps come out. And also, I believe this process goes through the county, the Buncombe County. So Buncombe County will coordinate everything with the municipalities.
Thank you, Amy, for that additional information. And again, it's just it'll be a continuous conversation around flood ordinance and maps, clearly for the rest of 2025 and probably for a lot of 2026. We're all going to be experts on this by the end of it. So last item on the agenda is under new business, and that's a resolution adopting your legislative agenda. I'm going to call on Brad just to give a really brief update of that item.
Thanks, Ben, and good morning, council members. It is that time of year again to give consideration to your legislative agenda. This is what we use on sort of an annual basis to communicate your priorities to our local legislative delegation at the state level. Unlike previous years, we've taken a slightly different approach this year. That may just be 1 year or 2 years, it's to be seen, but the goal this time is to focus specifically and primarily on recovery related issues, primarily recovery funding. And because of that, we've tried to focus our legislative agenda such that only those items would appear on it. This does not mean that other legislative priorities that still have not been acted on by the state are going to go away. We're going to continue to advocate for those through all of our lobbying channels, but in order to draw the most laser focused attention to these particular funding items that are so crucial to our recovery, we wanted to limit your legislative agenda to just those items. So the proposal that will come before you on Tuesday has 4 items on them. The first 3 items are all recovery focused. They deal with asking for the state government to cover the 10% local match for all of those public assistance FEMA related reconstruction projects. We're asking for local funding to be made available for revenue replacement for local governments, and then ongoing monetary and other related legislative support as our recovery likely stretches on for many months and perhaps years. The only other item on your legislative agenda is somewhat related to the recovery, but definitely something that's very important, I think, and something that you're going to be hearing a little more about later on in this particular briefing. And that is a request for some reconsideration to some recent legislation that altered the local government control over zoning, specifically down zoning. So that is what is on your legislative agenda. I would ask any council members prior to Tuesday, if you have any sort of questions or concerns and have not already done so, please reach out to me. We can make any amendments or adjustments as necessary up until that point. Yes, Kim.
Yeah, I think the reason that I'm asking for this is because it is Helene recovery related. But I had sent to Brad support for the current legislative agenda, and I also wanted my colleagues here to know that I had asked, while supporting our homestay permitting process, I wondered if we might also include common sense ability to regulate short-term rentals in the city limits so that we can find more solutions for long-term housing solutions in our community. I think waiting for it to just kind of trickle in the direction of recovery might not be enough at this moment.
Can you say more about that? I mean, we're regulating short-term rentals through our zoning ordinance, which we still have the legal ability to do. What would we want from the legislature on that? What would be helpful?
Well, I was looking at our previous legislative agendas, and I think something similar would suffice. In general, I think we're going to have to make sure that we have the ability to regulate them at a local level.
Brad, you'll have to remind me what we were requesting before relative to short-term rentals.
So Mayor, we actually,
Go ahead.
we had two items on previous agendas regarding short-term rental. The first was essentially just a request to oppose any legislation that would restrict the power that we're already utilizing, which you've mentioned. The second was a little more specific. We had asked for general legislation, which would require the short-term rental platforms to participate in the enforcement process. There's a permitting stage which could be utilized. So it was very specific to that particular issue. That's something that would be a step forward from what we have right now, just to increase enforcement capabilities, something that we've asked the legislature for in the past, but has not yet been acted upon.
Okay, well, yeah, and so what I'm understanding, Brad, from your proposal for this legislative agenda is let's kind of get laser focused on what we need related to Hurricane Helene recovery and try to shed things that we don't think are going to have traction in this legislative session. So that's kind of the lens I'm looking at any item through, while I obviously have been a major advocate for being able to regulate short-term rentals and forcing the platforms to work with us in terms of enforcement. Given the fact that we mostly spend our time fighting the legislature on completely preempting us from being able to regulate them all, I doubt they're going to grant us any more authority than what we've got right now. I actually, based on my conversation with Senator Tim Moffitt yesterday, seems like any movement on land use is actually in the opposite direction, continuing to preempt us in the legislature, unfortunately. So I'm just thinking about it like that. Not that any of these ideas are bad ideas. I just hope that we do see some relief related to the hurricane, and I'm in agreement with Brad's strategy to try to stay focused on that.
Sage, I know you tried to chime in just a minute ago. I didn't know if you still had a question.
Not a question. I was just going to help out by reminding us that it was the permit field issue, which I also still care about. I don't think it's going to even get attention, and I agree that the focus should be on recovery efforts, but I don't want these past issues that we have needed so badly to go away. So let's hold them over for next year. I think what we had last year, both of those items were great, and we should continue to push for them. Other cities have them, other states have them. We can have them.
To that point, Councilmember Turner, you're going to hear in my presentation to the full council, not just a list of the priorities that I'm proposing for inclusion in this one, but I want to reiterate every single pending item that we have from previous agendas, which have not yet been acted on, as part of my assurance that we're going to continue to press for those things, whether it's asking for support or asking for new legislation or to oppose new legislation. So I will plan on listing publicly every single legislative item that existed and continues to exist from previous agendas, and keep those for inclusion in future agendas. But in any case, we're going to continue to lobby for those things through every channel that we have, whether they are included on this or any future legislative agenda, until council tells me to stop.
Thank you, Brad.
All right, with no further questions, I will hand this back to Ben.
Hey, before we go back to Ben, and sorry to back us up, but council, on the flood ordinance item that Ben went over, it is looking to me, Ben and I had a chance to kind of debrief from some of his meetings with the community. It is looking to me like we can expect at council probably in person, but maybe just by email. Opposition to changing our standard to require the 2 feet above freeboard for properties that are having to be reconstructed due to Helene and trigger that 50% threshold. So again, remember, if you're building a brand new building and nothing was destroyed, nothing pre-existed, our current code would require you to build 2 feet above freeboard. Am I saying that right? Yeah, 2 feet above freeboard. But if you had an existing building that was non-conforming and you exceed 50% damage, that's what we're talking about. Do you have to build just a freeboard, or which is an elevation, or do you have to go 2 feet above that? And actually, there's a lot of situations where even you probably have to be at least 1 foot above freeboard anyway. We are going to hear probably some strong opposition to that, and sort of couched in terms of, the city's not being helpful, it's standing in our way of rebuilding, and so I just want you to be thinking about, whether or not, sort of which option you want to be supporting, whether you're going to go with the staff recommendation of the 2 feet above freeboard, or whether you want to agree with, and again, maybe it'll change by Tuesday night, maybe we won't see this opposition, but just so we can sort of clearly communicate to Brad sort of option B, and he can be ready for that. So option B would be to just more or less codify the rebuild trigger as just being at freeboard and not above freeboard. Yes, Sage. Anyway, I hope I didn't muck that up even more. Sometimes we don't talk about that in these meetings, and then we get closer to the actual council meeting and it's like, whoa, there's this whole division and people are confused and they want to know what the options are.
Thank you. No, I appreciate your synopsis there, but I have one layer that is still missing for me is the historic structures and whether designated historic structures are exempt from the new criteria, even if they're over 50%. And then the other thing that's really missing is if some, we put this out earlier, if some that are not currently designated as historic could be retroactively designated, because I wonder if that would remove a lot of the opposition for some of the larger buildings. I mean, we have some really beautiful historic structures that won't be able to be rebuilt as is. And I mean, I know I've talked with architects about the process of trying to flood-proof an existing foundation. It's really not feasible. So if we knew that some historic structures or, potentially some retroactive structures could be preserved, that might help some of this. Did we ever get any information on that?
So I'm going to take a first shot at that and welcome Brad to chime in as well. So if you are a designated contributing or historic structure and you are substantially damaged, you're absolutely able to pursue an exemption from the flood requirements through the variance process. So Councilman Turner, we did land on, in North Carolina, we don't have an administrative ability to issue that variance or exemption. So it does have to go to the Board of Adjustment, but I will say that staff is actively working on finding ways to make that process as streamlined as possible. So we know that historic structures are going to pursue that, and we are going to be prepared to manage that workload and do that expeditiously. So again, that's part of that FAST team is if you're an historic structure and you're in or around 50%, please schedule that appointment. Let us help you get into that variance process. Now there's criteria and findings, so there is things that have to happen, but we can help applicants manage that. Brad, anything else you want to, I feel like I covered that probably pretty well, but anything you want to add on that or?
I just want to see if I can address the second question that I think Councilmember Turner asked about sort of retroactively getting yourself designated historic. So it's not so much retroactive as it would be just the sequence of events. So if a property owner were to be in a position where they've been damaged by the hurricane and they decided that they wanted to get a designation as historic property, they could go through the same process that everyone else goes through and get that from our local Historic Resources Commission because we're part of that state program. Now, they would have to do that in advance of then seeking the variance, which would allow them, if they were actually designated as historic, then they would have the exact same protection allowances that pre-existing historic properties would have, that they could utilize the variance process to exclude them from this. But those are multiple third-party boards that would have to make those decisions. So certainly staff can't make any guarantees about that, about whether or not they would be able to be designated as historic and whether or not they would get their variance. But all of those things could happen in that order that would allow them to take advantage of that hypothetically.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I think that could matter. I mean, ahead of Tuesday, do we have any data on how many of these structures over 50% are also historic, currently designated? Do we know any of that?
I think we should be able to have some approximation of that in the follow-up document. I know that Mark Matheny, that's the question that's come up, and I know that we were going to try to work on that, see if we can get some rough approximation of what that looks like. So for example, we do know the number of potentially substantially damaged structures. So it's really just within that number, kind of where are those located. So I think we can have some of that data by Tuesday. Hopefully. If Mark really disagrees, he needs to say something, but that's something we are working on. Okay, I'm gonna keep moving.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, sorry to thanks for the. I'm looking around. Deborah, you see someone's hand up. Say it.
I thought Mark was going. I thought he was ready. There you go, Mark.
Yeah, good morning. Sorry, I apologize. Had to put my cold chicken down. Yeah. So this is where I get lunch. So we are working on it. We've got a document that basically references everything that is within that substantial damage. Yesterday at the Biltmore Village, they had asked to determine, how many are actually in Biltmore Village. So we're working on that. So we're trying to get a number for that so we can work with them. There is a little bit of a trick with the historic buildings because we don't have the specific inventory of every building that is, but we're going to work on that and get you the best information that we can, certainly by Tuesday.
Thank you, Mark. Any other discussion on our business agenda before I move to the next? Okay. So again, as Ms. Campbell mentioned, no council committee. So I have 3 items I want to flag for council on the 8-week agenda. Last night, Planning and Zoning Commission moved forward 3 housing-related UDO text amendments. So those are now officially scheduled for your February 11th meeting. Those were 3 amendments that were being worked on prior to Helene. They address thresholds for review, residential and commercial parking requirements along corridors, and then land uses or allowable uses and some other minor dimensional requirements for commercial uses along commercial corridors. So again, those were really the first batch of UDO amendments that we were teeing up. We did take those back to Planning and Zoning Commission. We wanted to take a fresh look at those through our recovery lens, as well as through the SB 383 lens, which Brad will talk about later. Planning and Zoning Commission did recommend in favor of those. So those will be before you on February 11th. And Nikki and Stephanie's manager's report presentation that night, they'll touch on some of that as well. The other item is your retreat is scheduled for February 13th and 14th. Topics include for the retreat, tentatively right now, is the budget outlook, our organizational work plan, Helene response and recovery, and long-term recovery. So those are kind of the buckets that we are planning for discussion at your retreat. Last thing I want to note, March 11th, you have your first FY26 budget work session scheduled for 3 p.m. So amongst all the things that we're doing, we're going to kick off our budget process as well in March. Any questions on the 8-week agenda? Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Wood to give a quick review of the recovery briefing topic schedule.
Thanks, Ben, and good morning again, Mayor and Council. As is evidenced by today's agenda, pretty much every agenda briefing as well as city manager's report for the foreseeable future. We have planned topics for recovery, just given the breadth of different activity that are happening around the organization and the community in the space of recovery. In the interest of time, Ben already covered nicely the items that are coming to the January 28th City Council agenda. So I'm just going to hit on a few other topics heading into your February 13th and 14th retreat. On February 4th, we've got the Board and Commission Chair Work Session, where the chairs of each of the boards and commissions are going to be asked to provide feedback on long-term recovery as well as our upcoming budget process. And then February 6th, which is your next agenda briefing, you're going to receive a comprehensive overview of the different federal funding streams and how they work together. So as part of that presentation, we'll focus in on how we leverage the different funding streams based on the type of project that's being constructed, including if there are new resilience measures or if we are rebuilding like for like to the previous state of the asset. Also on February 6th, James Shelton, our Community Development Division Manager, is going to provide a detailed process overview on CDBG disaster recovery funding. And in this presentation, he's going to focus primarily on the process we'll go to have the action plan adopted per the HUD guidelines. Also want to note on February 11th, Nathan Moneyham with NCDOT is going to provide updates on the I-26 connector project and talk about how the schedule and scope of the project has had any impacts related to this storm. And so those are the topics I wanted to highlight. And with that, we'll kind of transition into the other issues section of the agenda. And as the city manager stated at the beginning of today's presentation, Jade Dundas, as well as Madeline Stoddart with Haggerty Consulting, are going to give an overview of the state of city assets, as well as a detailed description of the FEMA public assistance reimbursement process. So with that, I will turn it over to Jade.
Good morning, Mayor, members of council, Jade Dundas, Capital Management Director. So yeah, let's bring it up. Presentation there. So we're gonna go through the FEMA recovery process. Are we supposed to be seeing that in bigger, Talia? I just see it as a small, and maybe it's just
it's bigger for us, Jay.
Okay. Okay. Then I'll just work off of the one I have up here on my computer. We're going to be working through essentially where we are, where we've been, all the work that we've done to assess damage through the time since the hurricane, and then also kind of map out the path forward. So the key takeaways for the presentation today, as staff has inventoried the damages of public infrastructure and is in the process of developing detailed assessments to assist with the FEMA formal process for the field inspections and scoping projects, which Madeline will get into a little bit more in her section as far as the formal process. Considering damages in two different categories, we just feel like and I'll explain this later in the presentation, as categorizing helps us to understand how to make things more manageable, and to help understand which path they go on with regard to recovery efforts. This presentation provides details on the damages, and so we'll list those out and show you some pictures, images of the damages specifically, and then also staff is working to ensure that we maximize state and federal funding. And then lastly, the topic that will cover first is the presentation of this outline and the opportunities and challenges of the FEMA public process. So FEMA, this PA process, public assistance process, is a journey, but we're working through it. Like I'd indicated, we're doing work right now to facilitate and to make the process as efficient as possible. Staff is doing a lot of field work of our in anticipation of the FEMA efforts on the ground. And so working through that. Recovery is complex, and so we're really trying to strategize and figure out the timelines for the most efficient way through the process. And then public engagement is important. We have done a ton of public engagement in planning efforts prior to this, Recreate Asheville, GAP plan, various other planning efforts, being able to really use that, but also understanding that the landscape has changed dramatically. And so we'll need to engage in the public early and often through the recovery process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Madeline Stoddard and have her walk you through the details of process or the PA process.
Thank you, Jade. Good morning, Mayor and members of City Council. Thank you for having me today. My name is Madeline Stoddard. I'm a recovery manager with Haggerty Consulting, and I have been supporting the city through designing a cost recovery strategy for FEMA public assistance for the past few months. And really excited to talk about the process. As you know, FEMA public assistance is, as Jade mentioned, a very complex process. It is designed as a reimbursement program. And so following the process and adhering to the steps of this process is the best way to manage risk around accessing federal funds under this program. The process is designed to allow FEMA to determine both that the applicant is eligible, that the damage is eligible, the scope of work is eligible, and the cost is eligible under this program. Those things are seem like discrete entities, but they all interact together. And so this process, linear process flow that you're seeing talks about each of those phases that FEMA uses to understand the recovery needs of the applicant, in this case, the city of Asheville, determine the level of eligibility and support that the city of Asheville is entitled to under the FEMA Public Assistance Program, and then a method to determine the appropriate scope of work and cost that the federal government will pay for under this program. So what we'll do in this presentation is break down those phases into subsections, so we can talk about the work that the city has already completed and what comes next, and the criticality of adhering to this process to minimize risk to federal funding. I want to move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the first phase is the applicant coordination and evaluation phase. This is the phase where FEMA determines that the city of Asheville is an eligible applicant and that they are fulfilling their requirement to educate the city on the complexity and the components of this program, on what the city will be required to demonstrate to be able to access federal funding. The first major steps of this, the completion of a request for public assistance and the recovery scoping meeting, the city has already completed. The recovery scoping meeting was completed on January 16th, 2025. And that starts the first real administrative deadline to identify all Helene damaged assets within 90 days. That process leads us into the impacts and eligibility phase, where the city will work with FEMA to identify damaged assets, complete damage and site inspections. So FEMA can physically confirm that the damages are due to Helene and therefore eligible under this program, and then formulate the detailed damage description and dimensions, which is the core of how FEMA structures a grant. Anything that is completed prior to agreement on damages is a work that would be considered at risk. So the city can move forward, but there's additional risks associated with getting that work reimbursed that the City of Asheville team and the Haggerty team have worked really hard to identify and minimize those risks where we can. The damage inventory is a formal process similar to an insurance claim where you're identifying every asset and every item that was damaged during the event. Anything that is excluded from that listing is ineligible for funding once that 90-day window passes. And so the city has been working incredibly hard to review all of the city assets, which Jade will talk about later in the presentation, identify those damages, and begin documenting that to be able to substantiate that request to FEMA public assistance. The city has been incredibly proactive at trying to address some of the issues and some of the parts of the process that FEMA takes longer to implement in determining damages and ensuring that that documentation is credible. Typically, applicants will have to wait for FEMA to ask them the questions about what's damaged, and the city has done an incredible job of stepping up and doing that in advance of FEMA being ready for it, solely so we can make those steps more efficient. Since again, we can't skip steps in this linear process, but we can try and make them as streamlined as possible by having that information ready to go. The city has also, in addition to performing their own internal inspections and detailed damage assessments, again, designed to make FEMA's field work much more efficient, begun to start requesting site inspections for both the less complex and more complex work that we'll talk about those two categories later in the presentation. Finally, once the damages are agreed to, then FEMA will work to identify a necessary and reasonable scope of work and corresponding cost to perform that work. Because all of this is tied to specific damages, skipping ahead and identifying a scope of work and a cost here is not something that FEMA typically does. Work completed, again, prior to that agreement on scope of work and cost would be at risk for the city. And we're doing all that we can to help minimize those risks where possible. FEMA approves scope of work in two ways. If the work is already completed, because in a lot of cases, recovery work cannot wait for FEMA to show up and to do all of the bureaucratic steps that are necessary for this program to function. For that completed work, the scope of work and costs are based on actual documented work and costs. And the city will need to prove that those are tied to and in specific response to the damages that were incurred. Anything that is completed work in terms of permanent work that did not include a mitigation measure may not be eligible for mitigation, simply because the work is already completed and FEMA public assistance is not designed to pay for work to be completed twice. For work that is uncompleted at this point in time, the scope of work and costs are estimated based on pre-disaster design, function, or capacity of that facility, and has an opportunity to add in cost-effective mitigation. This work would also include codes and standards upgrades that are triggered by the construction that would be necessary for that facility. In addition to identifying the scope of work, this is also a phase where FEMA may identify additional compliance requirements for the work at a particular facility. That may include environmental, historic preservation, or other requirements necessary to ensure that construction of that project or reconstruction of that facility meets all of the state, local, and federal laws that impact that. Because so much of the infrastructure in the city of Asheville is adjacent to or within the flood plain, and the age of the facilities here are what typically FEMA would consider a historic. So anything over 40 years old would be considered historic. That it applies to most of the facilities that were damaged during the event. Those will have additional requirements on coordination with state and federal agencies on permitting and approving work prior to it beginning. Another risk of completing work prior to FEMA agreeing to that scope of work is, even if you didn't know that you were subject to that requirement, you are still required to comply with it. And so Again, for more complex work where we know there will be significant environmental or historic preservation requirements applied to it, ensuring that we have FEMA's buy-in and agreement on that work is the best way to mitigate risk on federal funding under this program. So that is all of the process on how we get to an agreement with FEMA and North Carolina Emergency Management for PA projects to be formulated. Again, the city is doing quite a bit of work to try and expedite some of these phases and to get all of the documentation in line that is necessary. And so we're excited to help support them through that process. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have on the process, or if there's any step in there that's not unclear.
Thanks for this presentation, and I think it really helps folks understand why we can't race right out and start construction on everything that's damaged in the city, because we would risk not getting reimbursed. And it's good to hear that we're trying to fast track that to the maximum way possible for under this FEMA structure. And I assume that for things like repairing the water system, which absolutely could not wait, that we will get reimbursed for things like that. The issue about going ahead and making repairs and potentially not getting reimbursed probably would be more related to like something they would consider non-essential, or something like a dog park. I'm just throwing that out there. I know for some people that is essential. I'm just trying to give an example. Okay, well that helps me, because I know I share the impatience of so many people in the community, and they want to see so many of our recreation facilities and our city maintained roads and all sorts of things repaired yesterday. I mean, I'm in that camp, but it sounds like we have to be careful to make sure we do get reimbursed. And if anybody who's watching, I think one thing that's been so confusing for folks is hearing that we're being awarded $225 million in CDBG-DR funds, which we will not have in hand for several months. But what we're talking about here is a separate pot of money that is available to cities and counties to rebuild their infrastructure that's damaged due to this storm. And this is a situation where we should be receiving 90% reimbursement. This is separate and apart from the CDBG-DR money, 90% reimbursement for all this work, with a 10% match, hopefully coming from the state. That is the traditional way this is done. So not a guarantee, but that's the 10% that is not a guarantee. So thanks very much for this presentation.
Yes, Councilmember Hess, I think you have your hand raised.
Yeah, so what I understand is there's kind of this expedited process through FEMA, and what I understood yesterday when I was hearing FEMA speak was that there's like category A, category B, where we can get 50% of whatever the cost may be up front, and then it can be adjusted. And so if they kind of already approve it in that way, is there a risk of them not giving us that other money is my first question. And then to the mayor's point with the more permanent things like the dog park and things that we want to kind of build back better, it was my understanding that there was also this A&E project kind of pathway where we could actually start the process, hire engineers, and get money for that on the front end. And so we can kind of be doing both at the same time. Is that my understanding? Do I have that right?
Yes, let me treat those questions separately because they have slightly different answers. So yes, there is an expedited process that the city did utilize to access funding under this program in a relatively faster method. It is federal funding, so nothing is immediate or exactly fast, but it is all relative here. For categories of work, for emergency work. So category A is how FEMA defines and funds work for debris removal. Category B is how FEMA defines and funds work for emergency protective measures. that expedited funding process is not available for permanent work. It is not designed to fund reconstruction of damaged infrastructure. It is limited to emergency work. The city did utilize that funding option to be able to get advances on funding. Those advances on funding are subject to the city being able to provide full documentation of the original estimates and to demonstrate that all of the costs and the work that was completed complied with the program. For the second part of your question on the architecture and engineering path, there are opportunities to, knowing that particularly some of these more complex projects will require a significant amount of design and engineering prior to construction being completed. Those costs are also eligible under the FEMA Public Assistance Program as long as they comply with all of the federal requirements and are necessary and reasonable for the scope of work that's being completed. There is an opportunity to request funding in advance for architecture and engineering under the FEMA Public Assistance Program. In some cases, that can be more complicated on reconciling those costs to specific projects later on. But as soon as we get the damages agreed to and the initial cost estimate for these projects, we and the city has a contract in place for architecture and engineering work. As soon as that work is completed, we can work on getting that reimbursed under the program as well. So there are two methods to be able to get that architecture and engineering reimbursement funded. You can do an advanced specialized project under FEMA Public Assistance. It's typically not something that we generally recommend because it can be a little bit more complicated on the compliance side, but it's an opportunity we can look into, or we can work to expedite FEMA agreeing to the damages for these projects and get obligated projects for the entirety of the project, not just the architecture and engineering, but the permanent reconstruction work and mitigation if applicable as well. And then the city can just proceed in that method. I hope that helps answer that question.
I'm just thinking about those washed out roads. Has that process started with them of getting the estimates and the engineers, and that way we can kind of get it going?
That's a great question. I think we're going to cover some of the status of those more complex projects and urgent projects in the next part of the presentation as Jade goes through each of the impacted asset categories and talking about how the city is planning to address those.
Yes, thanks, Maddie. Yeah, so I'll carry on from there. It's a great question, and we are considering all of the options for advancing projects and developing those. So as you see on the next slide, Talia. So this is a process that we understand is, as Maddie had explained, is very formal with regard to the FEMA's process for moving forward. But we do know that we have roles in this process as well as the public, and so it's important for us to partner with the public and stay engaged through all of the development processes, starting early we have been engaging up to this point in time. So kind of using that as the context for how we'll move into the explanation of what is damaged, what the inventory looks like, and then how we're going to process those to make sure that we're advancing things as quickly as we can. So next slide. Specifically, a lot of these briefings have been focused on the RSG work, and so I didn't want to leave that out, and Maddie touched on a lot of this. And so we are representing the infrastructure RSG recovery support group. The work that we've been doing right now has been divvied up into public works and water, the subgroup, parks and recreation, DCREF facilities, and then greenways as a subgroup, and then facilities and communications towers as another subgroup. Essentially, what those subgroups are important for is to be able to parse out the individual types of damage and be able to have experts within our own midst be able to inventory and then also assess the damage. So as indicated, the focus of our group up to this point in time has been doing the damage inventory. I'll show the list of the damaged items here in just the next few slides. And then also developing a very detailed version of our details of what the damage is, dimensions and scope and all this sort of thing. And again, these are important for us to have as a record of our assessments of the damage. So when we're sitting down with FEMA scoping in the future, that we know where we were at the time, where we have our own assessment of the damage. And it's also going to hopefully help through the efficiency of their site inspections and their review. Hagerty's helping us to create organizational process understanding and public understanding with a presentation like we're giving today. And then also the infrastructure RSG is that we're trying to coordinate all of the projects because there is a formal process that is necessary for us to all observe. So being able to really funnel the projects in through this group is pretty important to make sure that we're adhering to a process and positioning ourselves best for that financial recovery.
And
So
Jay,
I'm sorry.
yeah, before you advance, I just want to clarify for the public, DCREF is, if you could, that's Chris Core's group, Harrah's.
I'm going to try. Department of
Community
Community
Recreation.
Regional Entertainment Facilities.
Yeah, I just wanted to suggest that's Chris's group of
Yeah.
Harrah's and others. Yep.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a handful of specific facilities: Harrah's, Thomas Wolfe, JBL, Aston Tennis Center, and you'll see those represented. Some of those represented in the damage list here. So damaged facilities, we've designated open or closed and open. So there is so this is essentially the list that we're working off of right now. We're doing our best to try to move things, if at all possible, through projects that we can initiate sooner than later from closed to open. But some of these are more complex, as I'll touch on in a minute, and don't lend themselves to that type of quicker fix. Parks. So you move on to the damaged parks, entertainment facilities. Again, apologize just for the list, but there is so much here. I really wanted to try to establish the magnitude of what we're faced with. So moving on to, and then the entertainment facilities are down at the bottom of this on that previous list. Sorry, those are the ones that the DCREF facilities. Next list is needs a little bit of explanation. The roads closed? It was asked at last Tuesday's council meeting how many roads are closed. And technically, there's only 2 with hard closures on them, and those are Gaseous Creek Bridge, or Gaseous Creek at the bridge, and then the intersection of Old Toll and Ventry Road. That does not at all reflect the fact that there are so many damaged points in the infrastructure throughout the city, and don't want to diminish the fact that these are significant closures as well. So yes, Mayor.
Just to clarify, this is, we might want to, if we're going to post this presentation, which I think we should, these are city streets. There are state streets that are closed all over town, but, and I think people, all the time people are confused about what's a state street, what's a city street. So just to be clear here.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder. We'll include that note because yes, we are in Asheville and throughout North Carolina. There's a mix of city streets and state streets, and so that's always often confusing. And in this case, we'll make sure that's clarified. I will point out a couple of streets. The top 2 here, Azalea Road and Thompson Street. I would like to give tremendous amount of credit to Public Works. These streets had moved from the closed category into the open category for their efforts. They're major transportation network. They're part of the transportation system, and Public Works has really diligently worked from more or less the day one through starting with debris clearing through major reconstruction. But this was necessary in order to open up access and help with public safety and that sort of thing. So in those cases, they're not like completed projects for sure, but they have been moved from the closed category into the open category through our efforts up to this point in time. And we'll touch on that's kind of the indication of the complex versus non-complex. They're complex projects by all means, but because we can work on them in-house, they are something that we can advance a little bit easier. It's important to note that there are 200, this is not the full list of public works damage. There are 200 individual records of damage. Obviously, I wouldn't want to try to include those on slides, but we are considering ways to try to group those damages. So they might be by road, they might be by damage type, but it'll make it more manageable for us to at least even talk about the projects, but especially to be able to develop a project around them and to execute contracts for those in the future. And then repairs to infrastructure. It's important to note that even if it's a partial closure or an open road now, that at some point when that road is, or that land, the mudslide or whatever is being fixed, that will likely result in closures in the future. Next slide. Okay, the greenway system. The one that is hard closed is because of accumulation of debris is the Swananoa River Greenway. I know that there are areas within a lot of the greenway systems that have partial closures are somewhat inaccessible, but there are large portions of the other remaining greenways that are open and accessible. So a special note here is that Swananoa Greenway started a couple weeks before the second phase of Swananoa River Greenway started a couple weeks before the storm. The picture is the debris field that we're dealing with, one of several debris fields that we're dealing with on that project. And so in conjunction with the debris removal, that site has been reviewed by our contractor. And once that debris is cleaned up, they do believe they'll be able to start that project again. But that is not a recovery project in its construction of the greenway. But the debris piece of it is recovery related. And then just a couple of pictures of interiors. So, I think it's helpful for people to understand that some of these buildings, the interiors are just in really bad shape. A communications tower that they're working around right now, but it is an important part of our communication system, has been toppled. There's a couple others that are damaged because of the wind load. So we're investigating the damage on those. The next slide is a picture of Gaseous Creek, the bridge at Gaseous Creek, and in the foreground is the rec park. The stream bank is one thing there, but also the rec park parking lot is in the foreground of that picture. The next is parks and greenways. Devastating pictures of projects that we just invested in. And so certainly wanting to understand the significance of being able to put those back together. I would mention that, again, we'll talk about just in a minute, complex versus non-complex. Bottom right picture here shows Magnolia Park. That's fences where trees fell on. We can, with lower risk and due to the fact that might be an in-house work that's done, we should commit to doing that work. That's a project that we feel fairly comfortable from a cost standpoint, but then also just a complexity standpoint. But those are types of projects that can move forward. So we are moving projects forward. It's just that we're having to be very careful and selective about the risk mitigation strategies. All right, and then water is, a lot of the question was asked about the water repairs, and certainly those were done under emergency protective measures and that restoration. There are other follow-up items that need to be done at the water plants, but currently all plants are running and all customers are receiving water, except for the routine, the outages that we experience throughout the system on a regular basis. And then there also are resilience opportunities. So it's important to note, and it has been mentioned, that resilience and mitigation is an important part of the recovery effort. And that's part of the future scoping of a lot of these more complex, larger projects. And so certainly want to keep our eyes on there are in some cases mitigation funding through the public assistance process, but we're also looking at funding strategies for mitigation resilience from all other sources of grant funding. I'll stop there for a minute and take any questions and then move quickly through project development.
I just wanted to ask a confirming question, kind of based on these two sections together. When we have community members that are reaching out saying, we know that the city's working really hard on repair and recovery efforts, but when will we have more of our public spaces and parks open? It seemed, based on what I'm hearing, is that we are doing everything we can to line things up so that we can expedite the process with FEMA to be able to not only repair, but to recuperate the funding of the project to the maximum amount. So it's not that we're not doing the work. It's just we have very specific timelines of processes that we have to put in place in order to be eligible for reimbursement.
That's correct. Yes. And I'll try to graphically display that in close to the last slide, but hopefully that'll shed some light on that as well.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure I'm giving the right message out to the public, that the part of the work that we're doing is the part that's not visible yet.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. Councilmember Hess.
Yes, so thank you. Man, I just want to express my absolute gratitude, and also on behalf of the people of the city of Asheville, for all the work that you guys are doing in getting us back together. I met with some other electeds who are in smaller jurisdictions, and they just don't, have the capacity or the dedicated staff that we in Asheville do to deliver for the people in Asheville. Under the leadership of our mayor and Deborah and Mark and Ben and you and just David. I mean, it's really incredible. So thank you so much, and thank you for this update.
Well, thank you for saying that, and we'll continue to push forward. So, and so the next slide is really kind of getting into like the strategy for project delivery. And so we have the guideline, the guardrails, so to speak, of the PA process. But there are opportunities within that to those guardrails to really try to identify the efficiencies, the damage inventory work that we've been doing as part of that. But I'd also say that there's some strategies and the idea of like architecture and engineering and public engagement, really starting to try to like craft the ideas of what projects will be. So we're prepared, we're not waiting on that part of the public assistance process to initiate that work. So we do recognize that, and we're trying to identify all the ways that we can achieve that efficiency. So with this, we do use less complex and more complex, understanding that there's no really perfect reference to, categorize a project one over the other, because they all have their own individual complexities. But this is, I think, illustrates that helps us to like maybe triage a little bit and then understand how we can advance projects sooner than those that we need to the more to observe all of the process steps in order to be most at the lowest risk of losing federal funding. So essentially what general criteria for considerations for less complex is they address safety concerns or prevent additional damage. Again, that's Azalea Road. It's a complex project, but we needed to get it done. A roof project on a municipal building. Generally a 1-for-1 replacement. There's not much opportunity for mitigation in those. Is that we're going to go back with what the fence replacement is going to be our fence, so versus a bridge, which, what are we going to do with that bridge? So those are like the extremes of complexity there. We can do some of the work or all of the work with in-house labor or a simple contract, work performed with minimal or no amount of design. Also I also mentioned there's no or very little public engagement on those projects. A roof replacement just needs to be done. So we're going to bring that to council. There's opportunity in that process, but for the most part, we don't go out and ask about roof replacements. And then there's minimal opportunity for mitigation. Examples are municipal building, Thomas Wolfe, Riverside Cemetery, communications towers, and Azalea Road. Some pictures of these. Again, you'll see some of these are duplicate pictures, but they are, again, no project is not complex, but these are the ones that we feel like we can advance with minimal risk, with a minimized risk jeopardizing any kind of funding. So to define more complex work, it's kind of in some cases the opposite. They're designed a complex planning, design, contracting, and public engagement effort. Risk management strategy for PMPA reimbursement is more complex, and there's a higher risk of if you were not following the entire process. Constructability challenges. Madeline touched on historic and environmental significance because we are in the floodplain. There's environmental significance there's historic significance because, as we've talked in the past, we have old facilities, but there's environmental significance because we're in the floodplain in most of our damaged areas. Mitigation assessments and opportunities. There's a ton of opportunity for us to really reimagine some of the things that we have and make them more resilient and to avoid impacts like this in the future. So really wanted to take advantage of those opportunities, and they have a higher cost. So higher cost brings more risk. Just a couple of examples of those are Gaseous Creek Bridge and riverfront parks. And there's no exception on the riverfront parks. They're all in that, I think, on the high complex. We are considering, again, the nod to the efficiency is like, how do we bring the architecture and engineering into as early as we can, but also, are there opportunities for us to group projects? Like I said, when you have 250 items to deal with, it's unmanageable. But if we can make good decisions about how we can group these projects, and it automatically makes it seem more manageable. We talked at Tuesday about the contract, our capacities, and using outside capacity, even the contractor capacity. So being able to really be strategic about the way that we're packaging projects moving forward so that we can take advantage of those limitations that we know that we have, that we experience all the time. And so really trying to get around those. And be more efficient in our recovery. You can phase it. The ideas that we're having is maybe we can phase projects so there might be able to open up sooner and makes things more accessible, and then incorporate in that same contract maybe a longer term resilience piece. So we're really trying to work through those ideas right now, and Haggerty's helping us with that.
And Jade, if we could also add that we are also looking at, from a contracting perspective, we are not going to accelerate things and not have an MWBE lens as well. That is going to happen. I just want to clarify that will happen.
Yeah, critically important for us, absolutely. But it is due to the federal funding piece of this. And we talked about this on Tuesday as well. Is that it is a requirement of any of our contracts moving through federal funding. So it's a DBE requirement that we have. Every time we do a project through the MPO or RADTIP through FHWA, we apply those. So yes, it's definitely and it's definitely top on our list, the equity and business inclusion piece. Here's pictures of more complex projects. When a boat's sitting in the middle of a velodrome, it'd be an indication that we need to consider, how those things come together in the future. And there's a lot of complexity associated with how that work's going to play out over time. All right. And I've been told that, and this is the last slide in the deck other than the key takeaways, I've been told that this is a little bit confusing, but I really think it's important to illustrate that there is an important consideration for less complex and more complex. Less complex, being a fence replacement, can really go on a timeline that allows us to feel comfortable and confident about us being able to commit to work and recovery, and have people see that efforts are going on in these less complex areas, and that can and is going on right now. The more complex really does have to abide by the FEMA process, but there are, to Councilman Hess's question, the design and resilience piece is something that we need to start on some of these projects. And so in order to be prepared for a scoping discussion with FEMA, And the other critical piece of this is the public engagement. I would say that we have started the public engagement. Our economic recovery support group and the cultural and natural resources group, they've been out there doing a lot of work with all of the business community, the environmental community, everybody trying to like really assess all of the work that was talked about with regard to the ordinance revisions. Those are the public engagement steps that help inform us long-term and how we recover. We met with Gashes Creek on Tuesday, the folks there, and they have some very big concerns about that bridge being out of place, and really gave us an opportunity to hear those concerns, and then also understand their points of view. And so those public engagement steps are already started, and they will continue to be a critical part of the recovery effort. Moving into the scoping, the costing, and then ultimately the construction and long-term recovery. So with that said, the key takeaway slide, I'm open for any more questions, and we appreciate all your support. Hearing none, Brad?
Thanks, Jay.
Yeah.
Good job. And Maddie, appreciate it.
All right, it's my turn again, Council. Ben has and Jade and the team have given you a very good indication of the magnitude of the work ahead, but I hope that it has instilled a certain degree of hope in the good work that's already been done. What I want to do is try to give you some of the bad news that goes along with this now, in the form of some updates regarding a recent piece of legislation that's going to have a very particular effect on your role in the recovery process, but more importantly, in your role as local legislators. So with that said, today I'm going to be giving you an update on some recent legislation that involved what we call downzoning. Next slide. As always, I want to start with a couple key takeaways or things I really want you to keep in mind. There's some complexity to this presentation and what's happened, but these are the most important aspects of this. This recent legislation has drastically changed the way that local governments are able to do what's called downzoning and the authority that you previously had to take these kind of actions. Now, these recent changes both broaden the definition of what downzoning is, and they also prohibit nearly all such action by local governments throughout the state. Now, this legislation is going to have significant and widespread implications for the future of land development and zoning regulation. However, we're still trying to figure out exactly how to go about interpreting and applying this new law. So there are some questions which remain unanswered. What we do know is that there is some hope that these recent pieces of legislation may be up for reconsideration for some changes in the upcoming long session of the North Carolina General Assembly. It's one of the reasons we've included it on your upcoming legislative agenda. But until that happens, and hopefully it will, the city is going to have to be very measured and cautious with any sort of land development or zoning regulations under consideration. Next slide. Some really quick background about the legislation that I'm talking about. This was originally styled as Senate Bill 382. That's often what you'll hear it referred to. And it became law, now designated as Session Law 2024-57, around mid-December. Now, despite this being vetoed by then Governor Cooper, the legislature voted to override that veto, and it did in fact become law. This bill was originally titled as the Disaster Recovery Act of 2024, but despite that title, there were several portions of this bill language which really did not relate at all to the Helene recovery efforts. And I want to highlight just one of those for you today. And that is specifically some amendments that were done to local government zoning power, a zoning power that can be found in North Carolina General Statute 160D-601D. This is a statute dealing with what we call downzoning. Next slide. So what is downzoning? Well, very generally, this is any sort of rezoning action that would take a property from one zoning category and move it into a new category that is either less intense or less dense in terms of its development capacity. Okay, so that's a very general definition, but that's what downzoning is. Now, this is something that's been around in the law of North Carolina for many, many years. But until this new piece of legislation, what the law did was essentially prevented third parties from downzoning someone else's land. So think it would prevent your neighbor from taking action to downzone your property. Local governments, such as the city, have always been excluded from this prohibition against downzoning. In other words, local governments were allowed to take such action to downzone. In fact, many of the actions that local governments often take would qualify as downzoning. I've given you just a few examples of that here at the bottom of this slide. Updates to zoning maps that change various zoning categories, text amendments to alter development regulations and allowances, and even the adoption of new flood maps, something that we've been talking about a lot recently. All of that, in certain cases, would qualify potentially as downzoning, especially under a now broader definition of downzoning. Next slide. All right, let's look specifically at the statute. Now, I will tell you that this bill that went through Senate Bill 382 was 131 pages of material. This particular provision appeared on page 130. So it is, for anybody looking to find it, it's almost at the very end, tucked at the very back end of this bill. Now, in this particular, this is the entire section of 160D-601. You can see all of the changes that were made. Everything that is crossed out represents language that the legislature took away. Everything that is underlined represents new language that the legislature added. I made the highlights personally because that represents the two major changes that I want to bring to your attention today, okay? The first one at the top of the page is where the local government's exception to the limitation against downzoning was taken away. This took away your right to downzone, which you've long since had as a local government. Now, at the bottom of the page, you see what used to be the definition of downzoning. And it's number 1, number 2, and number 3. Number 3 is a brand new addition to the definition. Downzoning has always been lowering the development density of land and lowering the permitted uses of land. But now, because of this legislation, it also includes a third category highlighted at the bottom of the slide, which is the creation of nonconformities. Whether that's a nonconforming building, a nonconforming lot, nonconforming structure, all of it would now fall under the definition of downzoning. But importantly to note, this new category 3 definition only applies to non-residential zoning, okay? So the creation of nonconformities in non-residential zoning. Next slide. I want to highlight now these two major changes in a little more depth. Let's talk about the last one I mentioned first, broadening the definition of downzoning. So in addition to the already existing definition of downzoning, which used to say that it meant lowering the total density that someone could develop on property and lowering the number of uses that could be developed on that property, a brand new definition has been added, and that's in non-residential zoning districts. If you take action which creates a non-conformity, that is now also considered downzoning. So what is a non-conformity? Well, this is any element of a lot, of the way a property is used, of the way it's developed, that is out of alignment with the existing regulations. So if a development, for instance, existed and someone built a structure on it prior to new regulations coming into place that are out of alignment with the way that structure is built or that property is developed, that would be considered a lawful or legal nonconformity. What that means is essentially that property has been developed under old rules and it's grandfathered into those old rules so that it gets to continue to be legal. Even though it's out of alignment with new regulations, that's still a legal property. All right. So an example of how this might come into play. If a property is developed and they build a structure 5 feet away from the property line, but thereafter the city adopted new rules that required a 10-foot setback, that property is now legally non-conforming. No one has to tear the structure down. The new rules, however, say that in the future, if something were to be built, it would have to be 10 foot as opposed to 5 foot from the property line. But under this new definition of downzoning, this sort of creation of a non-conformity, making that building that was built perfectly legal and would still get to stay no matter what, legally non-conforming with the new rules, is now considered downzoning. So as long as that action takes place in a non-residential zoning district, this would fall under the prohibition of an action that could no longer be taken. Now, all of this, I should say, is there's one big exception. You're allowed to downzone if you get the owner's consent. Okay, so that's always been the case. That still continues to be the case. So I do want to highlight it here. Now, this limitation applies to all land uses as well as structures and the lots. So it's pretty significant. All right, next slide. Now let's move on to the second major change. And I've already mentioned it a couple of times. And this is the first time in North Carolina history, local governments are now specifically prohibited from downzoning without the owner's consent. So we can still do it if you get the owner's consent, but you have to think about the way that local governments might take these kind of actions. It's very rare that we only rezone one property on our own volition. We might do that if the owner requests it, but generally speaking, when we adopt zoning regulations or development regulations, they're for huge swaths of the city or even the entire city. And the thought of getting every single owner's permission to do that in any case where there might be a downzoning under this new definition is essentially a bridge too far and beyond the capabilities for us to ever actually effectuate that. Now, because local governments are now prohibited from downzoning under this new rule, this would include a prohibition against actions that would decrease development density, reduce a site's permitted uses, or now, for the first time, create any nonconformities, even legal nonconformities that are in non-residential zoning districts. I did mention this business about if an owner consents. So what does that mean for you? It probably takes out conditional zonings or zoning changes that are initiated by the owner from this discussion. Those come forward on the owner's volition, which means they are essentially consenting to that. So this is really going to apply to things that the city initiates, which are going to be much more large-scale zoning changes. But despite the conditional zonings and normal straight rezonings probably being safe, many other zoning actions that we commonly take are now in very much legal doubt. Next slide. So what are the implications of these changes? We're still trying to determine that. Attorneys around the state are reviewing this legislation. We're asking questions. This includes the School of Government, whose faculty is analyzing this. And quite frankly, many of the questions remain unanswered. So the full effect of this bill is yet to be determined. However, there are certain things I think we can say with certainty. The first is that there are going to be some major changes to the way that cities and other local governments can take zoning or development action. Amending zoning to address new land uses is a big example of this. So people are creative. They often come up with new ways to use property. I've listed a few examples here over the past few years of some brand new land uses that 20 years ago, no one knew existed. Things like crypto mining, data centers, even short-term rentals. As these new land uses come into play, local governments adopt new regulations to decide how they're going to integrate those or restrict them in their own jurisdictions. The ability to adopt those kind of new regulations for new land uses is essentially now frozen. It's going to be very, very difficult for us to adapt to new land uses going forward. The second one is amending development standards. This could be anything from parking to buffers and setbacks or even tree safe. Oftentimes, those kind of regulations are going to be considered a downzoning because they might reduce the total density that someone has to develop, or on an existing lot, it might make them legally non-conforming because they will be out of alignment with the new regulations. Under this new definition, those are probably going to be restricted downzonings. Another one is a big one, something we've been talking about for some time, and that's adopting major changes to our UDO or even revamping our entire UDO. Necessarily, redoing your UDO is going to create changes that would likely fall under the definition of downzoning in not just a few, but probably many places around the city. And without going door to door and getting the consent of almost every potential owner in the city, it's going to essentially restrict every city's ability to update their UDO essentially forever going forward. Finally, something that I left till last because I think it's very pertinent to what we're going through right now, and that is this is going to likely restrict us from complying with state and federal rules with regard to adopting future updated flood and watershed maps. And I do see a question, and I'll finish the sentence and then I'll get to you, Councilmember Hess. But this is something that we are required to do by state and federal law, something that we are planning on doing in order to maintain our standing in the National Flood Insurance Program. But because flood maps change, and the adoption of those maps would essentially change certain properties' ability to develop in those areas, this is likely now going to fall in the definition of a downzoning. So we find ourselves conflicted. Because we have to comply with this new law, we're likely going to be forced not to comply with either state or federal rules, and this is likely to cause serious ramifications. Yes, now, Councilmember Hess.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Brad. This is very informative. I have a couple of questions. When I was reading over the law, I noticed that there was actually a 180-day retroactive period. Is that putting anything that's already been approved by the council or already in the works at risk?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I haven't highlighted in this slide for a reason, but it is important to note that not only do these restrictions start immediately, essentially from mid-December of last year when they took effect, but there is a look-back period of 6 months where this will also affect any zoning actions that would have fallen under this restriction going back in time. We have internally reviewed the city's actions during that period, and we feel safe to say that this is not going to affect or reverse any actions that we have taken. But that's certainly something that other cities and municipalities around the state are going to have to deal with.
Thank you. And then when it comes to updating our flood ordinances over in the River Arch District, I'm wondering, a lot of the business owners want to build back as they were, right? And we are asking them to do the 2 foot above freeboard. Would changing that ordinance put the city at risk of any legal challenges given this new law?
Another great question. I'm going to try not to go into too much depth on this. Happy to talk to anybody offline because this is probably a much longer discussion than we have time for today. But my basic answer is it is my opinion that it is not. We have crafted the proposed amendments in this with this particular piece of legislation in mind. And we even made some very last minute changes prior to the last council meeting to ensure that nothing you were doing was going to decrease development density for any of these particular properties. So I'm happy to have this conversation in more depth, but to answer your question publicly, I do not believe this the changes to your flood protection ordinance would offend this new statute.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, just to finish this slide, obviously we're talking a lot about building back better. I'm sorry to say that I think this particular new piece of legislation is going to have, to a degree, a frustrating effect on our ability to do that. It is going to greatly limit our ability to adopt or alter regulations that are going to adjust to the new concerns that we have regarding flooding, landslides, or similar concerns, as well as a near inability to adopt new and updated flood maps, which will bring into question our ability to remain part of the National Flood Insurance Program. Next slide. So in terms of a path forward, I do want to highlight the hope that I have that the General Assembly will take another look at this in the upcoming long session, which is set to start in just a few days. Until that time, the lobbying efforts from all local governments, as well as entities like the League of Municipalities, is ongoing. I myself have had conversations with multiple legislators over the last few days, and will continue to do so as we work to try to craft, hopefully, some changes that will allow some of the negative effects that I've highlighted today to be reduced or mitigated. Currently, there's a lot of questions. We don't completely know how to fully interpret every provision of this new law. We've not yet uncovered every pitfall that it will induce upon us. But what we know going forward, until any changes can be implemented, that future city-initiated zoning changes or development regulations are going to be more complex and in many cases limited. We must exercise an additional amount of caution as we consider those measures until and if a new set of changes to this new legislation can be made. Next slide. All right, I have, I see I've got an incorrect slide header to this. This has nothing to do with your legislative agenda, except it does because this is part of your legislative agenda. But I do just want to put those key takeaways up there one more time for your benefit. We can move to the next slide on this. And I want to answer any questions that you have about this, starting with Councilmember Roney.
I was just in Marshall the other day doing some volunteer work to be a good neighbor, and we are not the only community that's going to be impacted by these changes. So what does it look like for us to build a coalition across the area impacted by Hurricane Helene while we're doing this advocacy for updates to the legislation?
I encourage that to the greatest degree. Obviously, we've already built some relationships as of late in the what I'm calling the affected area of Western North Carolina to lobby for many of the funding advances that we've received from the state and federal government. I would suggest that this is now part of that broader strategy. You will, in addition to funding, need these types of legislative tools to truly build the kind of resiliency and recovery that you are looking to effectuate. So I suggest talking with other local government elected officials to make sure they are fully aware of this and that we can be on the same page, that we are looking to push the state legislature to give some consideration to what I think are some unintended consequences that may not have been given consideration so that we are all moving forward together. But most importantly, make them aware of this, let them know that they need to be reaching out to their local delegations and asking for changes so that these tools can be re-empowered at the local government level.
And then my follow-up question would be, what impact does this have on our ability to access funding for recovery for residents, for businesses? And is that part of the conversation as we're advancing this request for a legislative change?
This is an important aspect that I'm not sure the General Assembly was completely appreciating when they adopted this. We're okay today and tomorrow, but at some point, we are going to be required to continue to adopt changes to our flood insurance ordinance, our flood protection ordinance, in order to remain in good standing with the National Flood Insurance Program. You are already seeing some of those requests coming before you last meeting and your next meeting, but there will be more to come. At very least, we will need to adopt changes to the flood maps, the FEMA issues periodically. I believe that this legislation prevents us from doing that. And if it prevents us from doing that, it brings into question our compliance with the program. And if we are not compliant with the program, we could be suspended or even removed from it. And that puts the city in jeopardy of receiving future federal funds very clearly.
Thank you, Brad.
Yes, Councilmember Allman.
Do we, and Brad, it might be someone else on the team, have the latest estimate of when we might see flood maps, new flood maps from FEMA?
What I've heard, and I don't want to take words out of Amy's mouth because she does an excellent job of presenting this, but there's still some work that needs to be done, but I think you're going to see some at least preliminary maps in just the next few months.
I'm going to stretch that out a bit. Preliminary maps, early to late winter of this year, 2025.
Thank you. Well, I will chime in, I guess. In the absence of us having committee meetings, council committee meetings up and running, and with the retreat coming up soon, I just wonder when council can kind of take this information we're learning and have some type of conversation about it, because there's a lot of the previous work plan that we've been working on for the last several years that connects to what you're talking about. So it's less of a question seeking an answer and more of a, I really want to dig into this with peers of what are the implications of where we've been going and where do we want to go, where can we go, as we consider new work plan with recovery, old work plan. I think this is a pretty important one to talk about, considering things that we've been working on in the past.
Yeah, I think that's the appropriate thought. As we move forward, there may be some time during your retreat to discuss some of, at least incorporating this into your discussions about how you move forward. For now, I really want to focus council's attention on my optimism that there is a chance that the legislature will not only revisit this, but might look to make some positive changes in this legislation. And that will really redefine the landscape that we're talking about here. So before we completely set ourselves to what is a very negative forward-looking picture, the more energy that we can devote towards pressing our legislature on making some positive changes, the better, because we're looking at that process starting up just within a matter of days.
Positive changes to this hastily passed legislation from last session. Is that what you're saying?
Hopefully so. Hopefully so.
So Brad, I know. I mean, is there are the municipal attorneys coming up with some kind of agreed upon changes to the legislation that would not have these inadvertent ramifications, like we need to redo our whole UDO, those kind of things. I mean, yesterday we were in a meeting with I was meeting with Senator, I keep calling him representative because he used to be a representative, but Senator Tim Moffitt, and he was saying, he was sort of acknowledging that this legislation was in a 130-page bill, and there wasn't a lot of scrutiny around it, and that it needed, in his mind, even though he supports the concept, he's a land rights kind of in his political position, but even though he supports the concept, he acknowledged that it needed to be amended to avoid unintentional consequences. So is there a movement among the attorneys to come up with some agreed upon changes to be able to address the unintended consequences?
The short answer, Mayor, is yes. I will tell you that effort is coalescing as we speak. Some people are discussing what is the best path, whether or not it is a series of local changes or if it's a general act, which is what I would support. The League of Municipalities is trying to organize some of that effort at this point. It is important for us to try to have a better understanding of what the proponents of this original bill wanted, what is their must-haves, before we can really put something as a compromise piece of legislation up for their consideration. So some of this is probably going to start really in earnest once the legislature comes back into session next week.
And I'm sure with the Metro mayors, we're going to be bird dogging this too. As with a lot of this kind of legislation, we understand that origins were some, single incident involving, I believe, gas stations in Durham. And then, we're all looking at each other like, what just happened? So maybe there is a more exact way for the legislation to have been enacted rather than to have such broad implications for everybody.
We're working on those alternatives now, Mayor, and I will keep this council updated with how this process goes or any changes that I suspect may or may not come down. Any additional questions about this item? All right, hearing none, I thank you for your time this morning, and I will hand it back to our city manager.
All righty, thank you all for your time. I know this was a lot of information that we shared today, but we will obviously be continuing to discuss most of what we shared. And with there are any further questions, Mayor, I will turn it back over to you to close us out.
And I don't have anything further myself. Anybody? Good. All right. See you all Tuesday evening. Thank you.
Bye-bye.